Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, a couple of Sundays ago, I was leaving church, like some of you, and I noticed there appeared to be a swarm of wasps along the walkway outside church here. And you may have even noticed them this morning. They were kind of intimidating. They seemed to be taking over. And so I talked to our custodian, Greg, and said, hey, we got to do something about this. Call our pest person and see what they can do to address this. And I was just concerned, someone might get stung. So they came out and determined they're not your typical wasp. They're called cicada killers. I hadn't heard of those kind before. They are a type of very large wasp, but they're very kind to humans. Only the females have stingers, and they almost never sting people. You have to be very aggressive toward them to get stung, and if you just walk by, they don't care. They're not territorial. They won't bother you at all. And apparently, it's the largest grouping our pest expert had ever seen. So you may get a glimpse of them when you leave today. They're pretty impressive, but quite harmless. And we decided to leave them in peace, which is fine for humans and less fine for the cicadas in the area. In the natural world, you see threats all the time. One of the most dramatic and emotional elements in any nature documentary is when you see one animal hunting another, whether it's a wolf hunting a deer or a lion hunting an antelope or wildebeest. Even in the plant world, we see aggressive and almost insidious behavior. Buckthorn is an invasive species that most of us know in this area that's very invasive, and I think I mentioned a while back that another type of small voluntary tree started growing behind our house along a rock wall, and I used an app to identify it as a peach-leaved willow. And I've always wanted a willow tree. I'm thinking, this is great. I love the look of this thing. And I just love looking at it outside our window until I found out they can grow 60 to 70 feet tall. And it's like right behind our house. And I knew it had to go, but I just kept telling Maria, I just want it to grow a little longer because I like it so much. And I thought I might be able to dig it up and transplant it, but when I went out to finally dig it up, I realized how deep the roots were. I couldn't even get the roots up. I just took an axe to it, and as much as I could under the ground to get as much of it out as I could, but I just cut it down. It went far deeper than I realized, and I figure I may need to go out and cut down new shoots in future years. Might be an ongoing project now. Living things have a way of finding a way, whether they're the kind we want or not. Sometimes the things that replicate and grow and even take over are very detrimental. Like buckthorn, they crowd out other native species we love and decrease the ability for other diverse plants and trees and shrubs to thrive. A nature area that I've enjoyed walking since we moved here has been overrun by buckthorn. When we first moved here, there were some beautiful open areas with old-growth oaks and maples, and it's just overgrown now. I know that the city is making efforts to address it, but it seems like a never-ending battle. Doesn't the battle of good versus evil seem that way sometimes? Jesus told a parable that's often called the parable of the wheat and the tares, or just the parable of the weeds. You could see this as a continuation of the parable from last week. The farmer has started with good soil and the crop has been planted, but weeds have come up in the field now along with the wheat. What to do? You know, those of us who have yards or gardens all know the usual answer. It's time to go after the weeds. So what does Jesus recommend for weed control? What do you do when something insidious has taken up residence in your backyard, literally or figuratively speaking? The answer is surprising. Jesus does what he loves to do in parables. He provides a surprising, kind of shocking answer. Let the weeds grow. Forget about the weeds for now. If you pull out the weeds, the wheat will come up with it. The next time your spouse or parent asks you to go pull weeds from the garden, just tell them, sorry, it goes against my faith. And then if you're the parent or the spouse, just say, Pastor John says it's a metaphor, not literal. Go pull the weeds. The parable Jesus is telling about the weeds is really about enemies. Actually, it's more than just enemies. It's about evil. And for many years, the term evil, I think, was out of favor for a variety of reasons. But it seems to be used and accepted again by a wider range of people. It's one of the fascinating things you experience as a pastor when you serve for 2.5 decades. You watch how things fall out of favor and then come back again, and new situations change how we view the world. Our world today is filled with concerning polarization that seems unresolvable at times. Sometimes we do encounter people or forces or movements or behaviors that seem evil. My son recently came home and told us about someone he'd seen that day wearing a shirt that had a cryptic abbreviation on it that he had learned about previously. The kind of acronym was short for 6 million wasn't enough. In other words, 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust wasn't enough. That's real, and it's an acronym going around, and it was being advertised to those who are in the know in our proverbial backyard in Minnetonka. Anti-Semitism is real, and it's an evil ideology. I actually imagine the man who was wearing that shirt, and I'm shocked and concerned for my Jewish neighbors. But I also maintain a degree of compassion for the man, because those who get caught up in destructive ideologies not only threaten others, but are themselves negatively impacted and dehumanized in the process. I can name the thing that is wrong and take the threat seriously while choosing to see the person consumed by that as a human being in need of healing and redemption. Acknowledging that may change the way we respond. Helping someone find that kind of redemption is often a very long and difficult process. Over 20 years ago, after the attacks on 9/11, there was a lot of talk about evil in relation to Al-Qaeda and terrorists and those of other faiths. For those of us who lived through the shock and fear of that time, it was understandable. Many Christian leaders, including myself, however, preached caution about the use of the term evil and the ability to lose our own integrity and souls in the process of trying to eradicate evil from the face of the earth. Out of fear and hate, we can make all kinds of compromised decisions and make more nuanced and insightful understandings of the situation impossible. On the night of 9/11, my church in a suburb outside of Milwaukee held a prayer service, which many churches there did. The senior pastor I was working with at the time asked me to preach. And in my sermon, I used an historical quote from President Richard Nixon on the night before he left office. It was from his final speech to White House staff, and it was filled with a range of reflections from gratitude to regret. He stood in a position that gave him perspective on his mistakes and where he had gone wrong in trying to go after his political enemies and those that he believed hated him. All the events that led to his resignation. And at one point in his final words, he told the assembled group, "Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself." Whatever your thoughts are about the former president, I think they come from a moment of clarity worth remembering. There are two classic traps in thinking about evil. One is to believe in evil. By that, I'm not talking about devil worship, though that's a bad idea. But what I mean is we give the devil or evil more due than is deserved. I'm talking about fascination and fixation upon evil and the devil, which is a much more subtle way that we can believe in evil. We end up seeing it everywhere. And why is that a problem? Everyone becomes your enemy. The Salem witch trials are a classic American example. Overemphasis of evil tends to affix labels to other people, which takes away their humanity and which can itself cause us to become evil in our response. Believing in its seemingly insurmountable power, we can be led to take drastic and horrific steps to eliminate it, not in proportion to its actual power. Another pitfall or trap is to believe that evil doesn't exist at all. Why is it that that's a problem? Because we end up ignoring it and denying something destructive. Many theologians and philosophers have tried to better understand what evil is beyond the classic stereotypes. We can think about evil both on a personal level, but also on a social level. Some theologians ask whether evil really even exists at all on its own, or if it's more like a virus, metaphorically speaking, that isn't technically alive, but replicates itself in people. It can tend to spread through groups and societies. Every generation has people or groups or ideologies they identify as evil. Is there something you would call evil today? Would you get a different answer to that question if you asked people in other countries or from different groups or walks of life than you? One of the reasons many are reticent to talk about evil in general is it tends to get misplaced and abused. We tend to point fingers. We need a very clear-headed balance between acknowledging evil and not overestimating it or overusing it. Most of all, we need to remember that we can get drawn into it. Just acknowledging our own frailty and ability to sin in the course of combating it is one of the first steps we can take to addressing it. So that brings us back to the words of the parable today. What does God say about who is responsible for fully eradicating evil? It's not us, it's God. God is the only one with the authority, wisdom, and ability to do this. And why? We may not be able to distinguish between the wheat and the weeds. First of all, the word used for the weeds is a very specific one in Greek that refers to something called darnel wheat. It's something that looks a lot like wheat. It's confusing. It's hard to tell the difference. Inevitably, if we take up a project to end all weeds and eradicate them from the face of the earth, we pull up the wheat with the weeds, the good with the bad. Jesus suggests the weeds will be separated out at harvest time when the wheat is mature and ready. We have to trust God to take care of it. I don't know about you, but I find this parable simultaneously frustrating and comforting. Frustrating because I want a better solution. And comforting because in a nuclear age and an age of AI and biological weapons and many more, not to mention conventional war and routine violence in our society, there's wisdom and restraint. In restraint, calm, and patience. as frustrating and dissatisfying as that may be. Jesus' parable is intended to be provocative to make a memorable point. We need to be careful. The reality is that there are times we need to address the weeds, even if pulling all of them up isn't advisable. Like my peach-leaved willow, it was simply too difficult to get up the entire tree. So what can we do to address the weeds, the evils that we see? Jesus confronted the evils that he saw throughout his ministry. He prevented them from occurring. When a crowd gathered to stone a woman accused of adultery, he put an end to it and the unjust practices of that time. He confronted crowds who sought to persecute his followers or enforce religious laws that were meant to help people, not harm them. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus cast out demons, which are acts of mercy and compassion for the individuals involved. He sought to bring freedom and healing for those who were afflicted by evil. Jesus confronted evil. When Jesus saw the financial abuses happening in the temple area by money changers using high exchange rates to take advantage of poor pilgrims, he overturned their tables. It was a singular moment for him, but it happened. Is there evil that is perpetuated in the systems and institutions we've set up or that we allow today? You could point to certain modern financial practices and systems, ones that perpetuate racism, forms of abuse and exploitation. We can take steps in our society to deal with the dangers and evils we see in a way that align with the values and teachings of our faith. But when we do so, we ask some questions if we're going to heed the wisdom of this parable. Are we certain that we can distinguish between the wheat and the weeds? Have we looked into our own souls? Are the weeds only found in our enemies, or are there seeds of both wheat and false wheat in us? Are we doing our work with the right spirit and as much measure as possible? Working in God's fields teaches us restraint, humility, and trust. Restraint in seeking retribution, humility in understanding that our actions can at times cause more harm than good. But none of that should prevent us from doing what's required to protect and preserve life for others. Jesus confronted forces that would harm others, and we can address the wrongs and evils we see with a right spirit, knowing that God sees it too and is responsible for gathering it all up in the end. And we can also trust that as we persevere in faith, that God will gather us in as his good and faithful servants. May you trust in God's abundant and generous grace, and let hope and love, all of which comes to us from Jesus Christ, guide your heart and your minds. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.